to trip and to Birmingham. It's really lovely to be here, and I'm looking forward to talking to you today. So, narrative is a familiar feature of ethics education, as it's theorised and practised. Stories are central in many philosophical accounts of morality, and most ethics educators are adept at teaching the moral of the story. From fables to thought experiments, the idea that narrative is significant in ethics education seems fairly obvious. But what's less obvious, I think, is the nature of this significance and the reasons for it. What we find in many examples of ethics education are philosophical positions and teaching practices that are somewhat ethically and educationally limiting because this significance is not sufficiently appreciated nor leveraged. To the extent that it's thought of, the power of narrative is often assumed to derive from its role in ethical instruction, in practices of telling learners what to do and who to be. In an instructive dynamic, narrative performs various helpful functions for the instructor, such as enticing learners to submit to ethical instruction in the first place, articulating otherwise abstract ethical messages, and modelling characters and characteristics in ways that are put into context and therefore a bit more comprehensible for students. It's true that stories can wrap moral messages up in more palatable packaging and exemplify for students the kind of behaviours that their instructors want to instill in them. But this common sense explanation of the power of narrative barely scratches the surface, I think. To realise the educative potential of narrative, we need to examine the functions that narrative performs in inquiry. In an inquiring dynamic, narrative also engages learners as actors in their own ethical development. It creates for them new ethical insights and motivates the adoption of ethical values rather than merely modelling them as something to mimic. Story-centric ethical inquiry is, in short, a transformative educational activity that enables learners to evolve from states of ethical dependence to greater independence. And with this independence, they can navigate ethical complexity and ambiguity in the world without an instructor there to guide them. So the aim of this talk is to shed some light via philosophical argument and some stories on how and why this happens. I'm going to begin with a story that reveals why I'm interested in this area. I'll then offer you some definitions of ethics, education, and narrative that underpin my claims. I'll say a bit about where this sits in the philosophical literature, although not a lot. I'm then going to expand on the function that narrative plays in ethical instruction before turning finally to the role it plays in ethical inquiry, demonstrating, I hope, how this dynamic enriches and improves upon instruction. And then I'll conclude with another story about what this looks like in practice. Narrative is everywhere in ethics education. It's there when parents teach stranger danger to toddlers with picture books. It's there when teachers draw a Netflix series to discuss sexual consent with teenagers. It's there when priests preach forgiveness via Bible stories. It's in TV commercials aimed at discouraging drivers from drinking. Narrative is there too in our attempts to make intellectual sense of ethics through philosophical reflection and empirical research. You find story-like thought experiments in moral philosophy, and social scientific approaches to understanding ethics and ethics education are full of narrative case studies and vignettes. But the particular narratives we explore and the particular ways that we explore them make all the difference to the outcomes for education. Not every instance of narrative-centric ethical inquiry unlocks the power of narrative, as I'll outline in this talk. And to help underscore this, I'm going to tell you an embarrassing story from my practice. About a decade or so ago, when these thoughts about the significance of stories were still forming, I found myself in Liverpool Cathedral on the set of a BBC Two documentary called The World According to Kids, in which philosophy teachers like me had been invited to facilitate conversations with young children in boxing gyms and youth clubs in schools across the UK, and I'd been cast to work with a group of young choristers. I wanted to explore ethics with this group And in the months before filming, I'd suggested various everyday ethical issues that we could explore in role or through stories, including the ethics of spending money, cheating on tests. But the production team wanted something more juicy. Running out of time, I retreated to a series of classic story-like scenarios of the kind that'll be familiar to moral philosophers. So the trolley problem, the ring of Gyges, the Heinz dilemma, etc. But it was Garrett Hardin's lifeboat metaphor that caught their eye. In this example, Hardin envisages the world as consisting of several different lifeboats. Some are well-stocked, well-maintained and carry a safe number of passengers, while others are ill-equipped, chaotic, disease-ridden, and so overcrowded that passengers constantly fall overboard. What should the wealthy passengers in the lifeboats do? Asks Hardin in the original experiment. But with just a few days to go, the production team hastily redrafted the scenario in an attempt to make it more comprehensible for the children and for the TV audience. In the new version, it said nothing about how or why this motley crew, which included a prisoner and a mum and a doctor, had arrived at the point where they sought a place on a single lifeboat with insufficient seats. And there was no implication that those making the decision about who lived or died were wealthy people who already had a seat in the boat. Nonetheless, it was felt that this scenario would divide opinion among the group of choir girls and thereby produce some lively debate. Having settled on these unlikely contenders for drowning, the production team created an elaborate set for the discussion. I understood that it would help make better TV, but having done lots of work where philosophy meets drama, I also thought it might have some pedagogical benefit too. While I had grown suspicious of the skeletal use of pseudo-stories in ethics, I was hopeful that by discussing this dilemma while enacting some key decisions, it would flesh things out again, engaging the emotions and the imagination, as Martha Nussbaum recommends, and making the scenario feel more realistic and less of an academic exercise. But it didn't work out like that at all. That afternoon, standing in an inflatable dinghy, surrounded by bright lights, while children squabbled over large cardboard cutouts of a dog and a vicar and a smiling pop star, the absurdity of the exercise hit me. The children were sometimes deadly serious, other times convulsed by giggles, as one girl lifted the cardboard old lady out of the boat, explaining sheepishly that she was really old and would probably die soon anyway. Evidently, the scenario was ethically tone-deaf. Rather than providing amplification, the lights and the props only dampened things down further. Among this intelligent and sensitive group of young women, no further inquiries were made about who these two-dimensional characters might be beneath their crude, stereotypical designations of celebrity, clergy, criminal. None of the children speculated about why they may have ended up in a boat alone and how they may have ended up in the boat alone at sea, as if this part of the story was superfluous. And nor did they question their own strange godlike status in deciding the fate of others while apparently at no risk of drowning themselves. In the end, the dog was saved because it was cute, and the singer drowned because she was vain. Despite my frequent invitations to infer backstories, to expand on the reasons behind their judgments, or to reflect on their feelings, where the girls could not decide, a show of hands without any explanation sufficed, all to a chorus of laughter. This situation spectacularly failed to leverage the ethical and educational power of stories. It did not engage the emotions, nor the imagination, and as a result, it was more like a humorous maths problem than a moral problem. It was obvious from the pace, the tone, the substance, that this activity was in no way orientated towards the business of understanding what matters and makes life go well. And to my shame, this was going to end up on the telly. So what is ethics? And what do I mean by ethics education? While the terms ethics and morals are often used interchangeably, they have different etymologies from Greek and Latin, respectively, and therefore different resonances that I draw attention to by my decision to speak of ethics education rather than moral education. The term ethics, as people will know, originated in an ancient Greek culture in a world in which everything was animated and ethos was all-pervading. In Greek metaphysics, the sharp distinctions between fact and value had not yet been drawn. In this world, ethical judgment was driven by the expansive question, how should I live? This notion focused attention on the character of a whole person within the context of a good life. By contrast, the Romans inhabited a world with more ordered metaphysics. Theirs was a language of categorization, in which the notion of morality came to mean something more contained, namely, the governance of standards of conduct. At the heart of this conception was a focus on the status of action, the right behaviour in any given set of circumstances. Morality's question is the narrower, what should I do? It's the notion of morality in this narrow sense that has dominated the Western post-Enlightenment philosophical scholarship of the last few centuries, most notably Kantianism and utilitarianism. In some contemporary philosophy of education, for example in the work of Michael Hand, we still find the term being moral being used explicitly for universally enlisting, penalty-endorsing standards that govern social behaviour. And that's a quote from Hand. I understand ethics as a much larger category than morals, one which involves interpersonal considerations, often associated with morality, such as justice, equality, and harm reduction, as well as intrapersonal values, sometimes called prudence, which might include things like wisdom, pleasure, autonomy, prosperity, friendship, or fulfillment. This notion of ethics also extends to our understanding of the human condition and what is intrinsically as well as instrumentally valuable. And this includes extra-personal considerations, such as the value of art and culture, of living things, and the natural world. In this talk, and in my wider work, I speak of ethics as what matters and what makes life go well. And ethics education is therefore how we learn and how we teach what matters and what makes life go well. So this is a big notion of ethics education. In my doctoral work, I analysed the concept of narrative as both a practice and the products of that practice. So what do I mean by products and practice? Narrative products are the various stories that humans create and consume. My notion of narrative is not restricted to familiar works of drama, literature, and history. The narratives of the world are numberless, the critic Roland Barthes famously noticed. Like Barthes, I see narrative as something all-pervading, a ubiquitous, culturally privileged, and multimodal phenomenon. It's found in all times and places, among all people, and it takes an almost infinite variety of forms. Narrative products, therefore, are not just plays and books, they are jokes, daydreams, cave paintings, operas, anecdotes, all of those things and more. Despite their variety, these narrative artefacts share in common some features that I regard as being ethically significant. Among them are the fact that they feature particular people in particular places, facing predicaments, and all arranged into a plot. But my notion of narrative goes further still. The term narrative does not merely denote the ever-expanding collection of stories that storytellers tell. It also captures the narrative practices that produce these products. Following the psychologist and philosopher Jerome Bruner, I claim that narrative can be understood as a mode of cognition, a way of understanding the world that complements but is distinct from the paradigmatic mode of understanding that we see in science, maths, and logic. Narrative practices are the activities that creators and consumers of stories do in order to understand the world. These are practices that we all do, like connecting, inferring, imagining, and empathizing, that enable purposeful story creation and perceptive story consumption. Taken together, this account of purposeful and perceptive activity used to create artifacts that feature particular people and places in predicaments, but all bound into plots, constitutes my theory of narrative. When we think in narrative terms by creating and consuming stories, we seek to understand ourselves and the world in terms of what matters and what makes life go well. While we often express this understanding in neat, paradigmatic moral principles such as do no harm, these principles are often inadequate when it comes to learning how to live. As the philosopher Martha Nussbaum argues, our perceptions are prior to our principles, and certain truths about human life can only be expressed fully, fittingly, and without contradiction in narrative forms. These forms embody these truths and give the reader, or in my case the learner, appropriate tools to grasp them. These tools, supplied by narrative, are constitutive of practical wisdom, and they're at the very heart of my inquiry-based account of ethics education. So now I'll say a little bit about ethical instruction and then ethical inquiry. You'll remember I began with the claim that the significance of stories in ethics education is often assumed to derive its role from ethical instruction. And it's true that instruction plays an important role in ethics education. I'll outline that here before explaining how inquiry builds on this foundation. Narrative-centric ethical instruction is a directive approach to ethics education, in which the role of the teacher, in partnership with the text, is to convey ethical information to the learner. This information takes the form of ethical beliefs, which the teacher hopes will ground certain conventional ethical behaviours. This information, which may take the form of principles, standards, rules, laws, customs, concepts, examples, exemplars, mottos, slogans, affirmations, aphorisms, or insights. It's treated as if this information is encoded within the narrative, and also that it's extractable from the narrative, so that the ethics educator could summarise the moral message in a text or evaluate the moral summaries of texts that are provided by students. So this is where the idea that there is a moral in the story comes from. It's encoded there in the text. This explanation of the significance of narrative in ethics education rests on the assumption that ethics education is, in part or in whole, a matter of bringing about that learners know that certain propositions are true or that certain standards are justified. Such an explanation also implies that propositional knowledge of this kind reliably translates into good character and conduct. This mechanism of ethics education is knowledge seeking and habit forming. The goal of instruction is to ensure that learners acquire certain predetermined ethical beliefs and behaviours. In my doctoral work, I exemplify this approach in the use of some Aesopic fables, biblical parables, patriotic stories, and mass-produced children's publications. This narrative-centric approach positions the ethics educator as an instructor who, as you've heard, employs directive teaching methods to ensure that learners come to possess relevant beliefs and behaviours. According to this explanation, the moral of the story is discrete and intelligible. The ethics educator who conveys these messages acts as if they are infallible. This role they play, or posture, makes them seem as if they are less interested in eliciting the ethical perspectives of their students, beyond determining that these views conform with their own. And on the other side of the dynamic is the learner, someone who's positioned as if they are heteronymous rather than autonomous, because they are dependent on the teacher and the text for their ethical guidance, and they are accountable to the authority of both when it comes to putting what they have learned into practice. Another way to say this is that in an instructive dynamic, the learner is not yet ethically responsible for their judgments or their actions. You could even say they are irresponsible. In my wider work, I offer 6 overlapping and detailed explanations of what happens in narrative-centric ethical instruction. Here, I can only briefly summarise them. In an instructive dynamic, this is the work that the narrative provides for the instructor. Narrative entices learners to submit to a process that might otherwise bore them or berate them. Narrative articulates ethical insights in the form of principles or rules that the instructor wants to convey to the student. Narrative models via actors and their actions values that the instructor hopes the students will effectively copy. Narrative and narratives, especially when they're encoded in curricula, curate the ethical agenda for students, and in doing so reveal and conceal ways of living well. according to the judgments of the school or of society. The stories that we consume at school, they shape what we think is possible and what we think is right. Narratives can also expand the student's ethical experience, exposing them to unfamiliar people and unfamiliar predicaments. And finally, narratives can habituate virtuous acts, such as sympathising for others, which in the end may produce virtuous people, though not yet. All of this is important work. So mine is not an argument against ethical instruction, it's just an argument in favour of saying this alone is not enough. Let's talk about inquiry then. Narrative-centric ethical inquiry contrasts with, but also complements instruction. This is a non-directive approach to ethics education, in which the role of the teacher in the text is to facilitate discussion around the perception of particulars in the story and the insights they may offer for philosophical reflection. The aim of this kind of inquiry is to cultivate learners' ability to see what's ethically salient in unique situations, to understand, appreciate, and deliberate on those things, and to try and live well in light of them. Those facilitators who try to inculcate this kind of ethical know-how assume that ethical is in part, or ethics education is in part or in whole, a matter of bringing it about that learners know how to think, to feel, to imagine, to desire, and to act ethically. So it's not just about knowledge and that narrative-centric ethical inquiry provides an opportunity to acquire and practice these skills, this know-how, for which there's no substitute, according to Nussbaum. Again, in my wider doctoral work, I exemplify this approach in some practices of philosophy for children and communities, especially those that draw on picture books and philosophical novels. I also exemplify this approach in narrative medicine approaches that teach doctors to read their patients like texts. You find this kind of approach in some philosophical treatments of TV and film, and also dramatic inquiry, which is a pedagogy that explores ethical issues in role. So what I'm saying here is this is real life practice, just as instruction is. This narrative-centric approach positions the ethics educator as a facilitator, as you've heard, who employs non-directive teaching methods to ensure that learners develop the capacities required to confront complex ethical issues on which the educator has limited authority. In this dynamic, the problems posed by narratives are complex and contested, and in an effort to make sense of them, the educator is fallible, and the students know this. From this position of fallibility, the educator is therefore inherently more interested in enlisting the ethical perspectives of their students, since they don't know ultimately what, quote, the right answer is. Consequently, in such an inquiring dynamic, the learner is positioned differently. They are more free to autonomously form their own beliefs and values, but they're also more responsible for the implications of their own thoughts and actions, for which they must account, both to their co-inquirers when they're discussing them and also to society when they're acting in the world. So, having previously outlined 6 explanations of the instructive mechanism of ethics education, here I offer 6 more ways to understand the important role of inquiry. Again, there's only time to sketch here. These explanations claim that narrative doesn't merely entice learners, but also actively engages them in the work of their own ethics education, asking them to think, to feel, to imagine for themselves. Narrative not only articulates established ethical insights in the forms of principles and rules, etc., but it creates wisdom in students via novel or nuanced insights about what matters and makes life go well in particular circumstances, especially where broad brush ethical propositions are much too general to help them. Narrative in this inquiring dynamic does not simply model virtuous actions and ask students to comprehend and copy, but by contextualizing and examining the complexity of both virtue and vice, which so many narratives do so well, narrative motivates learners to discover what they personally value in life and to pursue those things and to embody them as part of a life well lived. Narrative continues to curate the ethical agenda for students in the form of the literary canon, for example, or the curriculum, which is chosen for them by the school or the state. But narrative can also critique this agenda. It can sensitize students to the power of stories, making them aware of how stories can corrupt them as well as cultivate them. Narrative expands students' ethical experience, sure, and it does this through exposing them to new story worlds. But it also explodes their ethical thinking, and it achieves this through exposing them to new and varied perspectives that come out of dialogue about stories. So they encounter not only the lived experiences of those in the story, but how they are interpreted by people that they're in discussion with. And finally, narrative goes beyond the habituation of particular acts towards the cultivation of virtuous actors, people who routinely and deeply think and feel for themselves and others and for the world around them. I don't have time to spell out in more detail how inquiry builds on instruction in each of these senses that I have highlighted, but I can give you one example of the movement from enticement to engagement, and that'll give you some sense of how the rest of my argument goes. In ethical instruction, narrative makes the process of ethics education more appealing for the learner, or at least more tolerable. This pedagogical use of narrative is evident when teachers, parents, advertisers, or publishers, etc., wrap a desired moral message up in a story, hoping it'll sugarcoat a particular moral. Such a view is psychologically plausible. A link between enjoyment and learning is a long-standing hypothesis in educational theory and in practice. And it may suffice as a basic psychological explanation for the presence of stories in many examples of ethics education. But it's a pretty insubstantial philosophical explanation because it sees narrative merely as attractive packaging for ethical information. But information of any kind can be packaged up in this way, be it ethical, scientific, or mathematical. This explanation does little to recommend narrative as an especially attractive or suitable packaging for the contents of ethics, whatever that content is taken to be, nor does it really explain such a possibility. While the use of stories in, say, mathematics education is a bit of a novelty, the presence of narrative in ethics education is just so ubiquitous and so intuitive that it requires a deeper explanation than this. What's more, learners may also be enticed by enjoyable narratives that are indoctrinatory, corrupting, or vicious. And so we need to say something more about what narrative does beyond it merely enticing students if we are to have the full picture. What narrative achieves in an instructive dynamic is to secure students' passive receptiveness to instruction, where otherwise they might have been resistant. But there's more to ethics education than this kind of narrative-assisted compliance. To be ethically educated is to be engaged in one's own ethical education. When narrative is employed in ethical inquiry, the learner is epistemically active and ethically awake. Skillful pedagogical use of narrative can and should place significant attentional and interpretive demands on the learner. Demands that necessitate active, intellectual, emotional, and imaginative engagement. The learner must ask, what does this mean? Why does it matter? What does it say about who I am and who I might be? And what does it imply for my sense of a life lived well? Done well, this is quite strenuous work. You can't do this work passively. But not all uses of narrative are equally demanding. When people assume that ethical knowledge is largely propositional, or that the meanings of narratives can be fixed, or that the right responses to narratives can be scripted and then drilled, it's not too difficult to choose or use stories in ways that are not at all engaging in the sense I have in mind. Instructors do this when they select highly moralizing stories or place an excessive emphasis on extracting the moral of the story. But when we engage with narratives in an inquiring manner, the attentional and interpretive demands of narrative cannot be ignored. Where this is done well, and where those demands are effectively met, a richer and more reflective and more resourceful kind of ethics education is possible. To be engaged by narrative is to be immersed in a story, to feel absorbed in it, to be transported by it. But this is not merely a pleasure-seeking exercise, although enjoying aesthetically successful stories plays into moral and intellectual virtue. To be engaged in a narrative is also to be interested, to have one's curiosity piqued, to believe that one has something to gain from inquiring further, and to be disposed to try and make those discoveries, to desire to make them. Narrative-centric ethics education, in this way, when a narrative-centric ethics education, engages in this way, when a narrative signals to the learner, through the aesthetic qualities of the text and via the teacher's pedagogical skill, that there is something worthwhile to learn here. To be engaged in a story like this is not merely to be enticed to open the narrative wrapping paper and find a neat moral message inside. Rather, it's to be invited by a text, to quote Martha Nussbaum, to perceptively read a situation, singling out what is there and what is relevant for thought and action, and to reflect on that, ideally together with others. I've argued that instruction on its own fails to cultivate the practical wisdom needed to determine what matters in life and makes it go well. For this, we need inquiry that is sensitive to the significance of narrative in ethical life and learning. My aim has been to demonstrate some of the ways in which an inquiring approach to ethics builds on what is possible via instruction alone, and is necessary for the kind of ambitious ethics education that I envisage, one which allows principles and perceptions to converse with one another, which is what Nussbaum recommends. Inquiry engages learners. It creates, motivates, critiques, and explodes their ethical beliefs and cultivates ethical behaviours. It helps learners transition from heteronomy to greater autonomy, from irresponsibility to greater responsibility. This transition allows them to operate in a world where they will encounter novel and nuanced ethical predicaments, where there will be no single moral principle or authority figure to tell them exactly what to do. Instead, they must, to quote Nussbaum again, improvise what is required of them, using their powers of perception and reflection. This talk has explored what it might mean for ethics education to look beyond the moral of the story, to realise the potential of narrative in ethics education. Here, but in more detail in my doctoral work, I describe perceptive, reflective inquiry that is narrative-centric and ethical, not as a single educational approach, but as a suite of educational considerations that can help move us in the right direction. I'm going to end, if you don't mind, with another story, one which shows how some of the insights from this work come to life in a real classroom. Last month, I was working in HMP Dearbolt with the experienced prison educator and philosophy teacher Andy West, as part of a project with the charities Thoughtful, whom I work for, and Blue Cabin, in which young men in prison talk about artwork that they have created. Although I've worked with many different communities in my career as a public philosopher, working in prisons is still fairly new to me, and I wanted to learn from Andy, especially because his practice involves telling the stories of mythic, literary and historical figures to prisoners and inquiring about them. He recounts his teaching experience in the memoir The Life Inside, which this year was made into a BBC drama called Waiting for the Out. His work embodies many of the qualities of perceptive and reflective inquiry that were lacking in my session with Liverpool Cathedral Choir all those years ago. In Dearbolt, we were working with young men who had experienced the care system before they were incarcerated. Behind each brief and often jokey contribution were private and unarticulated stories of struggle and suffering. In this class, we examined artwork that they had made, featuring an image of Nelson Mandela, pictured on Robben Island after his release from prison. Our inquiry that afternoon was on freedom. In the second part of the session, we had agreed that Andy would share a story about freedom from the Odyssey. This was a story he'd used in previous classes in prison and one he had discussed in his memoir. And as it happened, it was also an example that I discussed in my PhD thesis as a successful illustration of Prince. In the story, the crew of Odysseus encounter sirens on their voyage home. Knowing that these creatures will lure men to their deaths, Odysseus orders his crew to plug their ears with wax so they cannot hear the siren song, and he asks them to tie him to the mast, so that while he can hear, he can't follow the irresistible sound. His men are told to ignore his pleas to be released. In the reimagined version, which was written by Peter Worley of the Philosophy Foundation, all but one of the men survive. The man who succumbs to the sirens is overcome with longing and curiosity, and he unplugs his ears and he jumps to his death. Back in our class in Dearbolt, Andy chose to tell the story via a clip from the TV show, which served the dual purpose of telling the siren story and showing our students what other prisoners had to say on the subject of freedom, therefore exploding this dialogue. In the clip, the men are asked, who is the freest, the crew, Odysseus, or the man who jumps to his death? And in their responses, they speak with both perception and reflection, revealing glimpses of who they are, who they want to be, and poignantly, who they are prevented from being. The men with the wax in their ears, they're the most free, says one man given the pseudonym Wallace. They just get on with it. It's like us in here. We don't have to do things like pay bills or do the school run. We've got freedoms they ain't got. I'm free from choice. As the inquiry develops in the clip, others disagree. The man who jumped off the ship is the most free, Zach says. Maybe it took courage to give in to the pull of the sirens. Maybe he was the only one brave enough to take his freedom. Another man, Junior, counters. He wanted to escape, but what he did is like escaping your cell and climbing onto the roof. Where do you go from there? But Zach doubles down. He jumped off because he realised that that was the most free he could be in his situation. He jumped off because he gave up on freedom, Junior says. As our discussion developed in Dearbolt, Andy and I used the clip to encourage the class to consider not only the arguments, but the characters themselves, their vulnerabilities and coping mechanisms, their sources of hope and despair. The lads in our session identified with and then distanced themselves from the lives of those in the story. Some approved of Wallace's positivity, while others sympathised with Zach's nihilism. They carefully distinguished physical captivity from mental captivity and considered what it means to be psychologically free on a boat or in prison. Neither Andy nor I, from our position on the outside and with our freedom, offered any instruction. The class revealed how story-centric curriculum and pedagogy can combine in ethically and educative ways through the creation of interconnecting biographies that make sense of students' lives, and dialogic inquiry that both constructs and critiques the meanings of ethical concepts such as freedom. Against the backdrop of the life of a famous incarcerated freedom fighter, Nelson Mandela, and in a place where the deprivation of freedom is painfully real, this discussion of a story within a story, skillfully facilitated, beautifully shows, to me at least, how narrative-centric ethical inquiry advances the practical and urgent work of determining what matters and what makes life go well. Here are some references of some of the people that I've mentioned. And here are some contacts. If you don't already know how to reach me, you're very welcome to get in touch. But thank you.